So if you're watching this on the replay, I'm just getting things set up. Give me just a moment. I don't intend to edit any of this. So you're going to get this all in its full glory. All the typos and everything. So, all right. I am getting my slides up. And then we'll get started. So I see people signing in already, and it's 10:30, so that makes a lot of sense. We are going to get started. Let me just make sure I have everybody to where I can see everybody. Okay, so welcome. I'm happy to see everybody. I love that it's the beginning of the week and that it's coming up on a new month and that everybody's interested in figuring out how to fix this diabetes thing. So I want to make sure everybody's familiar. I'm sure I was using Zoom long before COVID, so I would have to go through and always kind of explain Zoom, but there is a chat box that I would love it if you have questions, you can put it in there. And there's also a question and answer box. You're more than welcome to use any of those options for asking any questions as we go along here. I want to make sure that you have that opportunity to answer any question or to have any questions answered as we go along. So the only problem is it's hard for me to keep an eye on the chat box and the participants list and also the my slides, keeping me straight of where we're at. So don't hesitate to put anything in there. I will try to make sure I'm checking all of those things before we log off. I'm recording this, so I will try to get this sent out. There are some folks who wanted to be here that couldn't be here, so I'm going to try to get this sent out. Sometimes that's an issue because I have to upload it to a link because I can't just send it out due to the size of the file. So look for that in your email later today or maybe tomorrow when I figure out the technology part of it. I've done it before, so I just need to work through it. So, all right. Make sure you tell me if you guys would put where y'all are from in the chat box. I would love that. I like to be able to kind of know where people are and where people are listening to me from. My dogs are up here. There's one little beast right there, and there's another one over there. Sometimes you'll hear the one shaking their head right now. Sometimes they like to try to WWF behind me and go into full-on wrestling. That's what's happening here. This one's trying to start wrestling with the other one. I hope that doesn't happen. I sometimes have to stop and rein those two in. So, all right, I'm going to share my screen. And we will dive in. So again, I think everybody's aware of kind of what we're looking at today, that we're really going to be talking about how to reverse your type 2 diabetes. We're going to talk about the strategies that I teach. I'm going to give you some good warning pieces of information. Before we dive into that, we're going to talk about the strategies. Chat is disabled, it says. Thanks, Julie. Julie's from Phoenix. I didn't realize chat's disabled. It doesn't look disabled on my side. That's interesting. Lynn is from Austin. Good to have you guys here. Type them into the question and answer because those are popping up for me. I must have hit the chat disable when I set this up, which I'll have to fix on the next one. So we're going to talk about the strategies I teach. We're going to talk about the warning, the kind of safety warning that I always give, because it's really important. So I want you to hear that. Hi, Laura from Michigan and Minnesota. Janice from Minnesota. So pay attention to that part because, again, it's really important. So we're going to dive into that. And then I am going to talk about the 3 strategies that I teach and then how to implement them. We're going to go through all of that. So hopefully there's plenty of time to answer any questions. And we'll have that opportunity. So the 3 strategies that I teach, and if you've listened to the podcast, if you haven't listened to the podcast, please find my podcast, Reversing Diabetes with Delane MD. I dive into all of these different strategies and the mindset and all of it that I teach with, that I work with my clients on. All of this I dive into and now up to 161 different podcast episodes. So there's a lot of opportunity to dive deeper into this than what we're going to get into today. But if you haven't ever heard, I teach 3 strategies for reversing type 2 diabetes. One is to clean up your diet. The second strategy is intermittent fasting. The third strategy is nutritional ketosis. Some women use all 3 of these strategies in different ways. Some women only use 1 or 2. Some women have been able to normalize their insulin resistance and reverse their type 2 diabetes by just cleaning up their diet. You kind of get to decide. I like to think of this as we're building a tool case, a tool chest, like a toolbox, for you to have different tools that impact your health. And the strategies that I teach all do this. The 3 basic strategies I teach are cleaning up your diet, intermittent fasting, and nutritional ketosis. Recognize in my group, I do go into other strategies, including things like sleep and how our stress level and exercise and all of those different things, how they impact our blood sugars and how to utilize that as a strategy, as a tool to improve your blood sugars. And yes, it is that important. I have had women come to me who have clean eating, they're doing intermittent fasting, they've tried nutritional ketosis, and they cannot normalize that fasting blood sugar, and stress is the underlying cause. Like, we really have to rein in stress management techniques to get their blood sugars to that optimal level. So we dive into some of those other strategies in the group, but recognize, I would say that 65 to 75% of your blood sugars, of your high insulin level and your high blood sugars, are going to be related or at least remedied almost entirely by these 3 strategies. So Karen's in California. Is it Karen or Curran? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but you're in California. So welcome from California. Not too early for you guys this morning. So the first thing I want to talk about before we dive into this is really the safety component. Recognize that if you are on medications, you can get into a lot of trouble making these dietary changes if you do not keep in mind that you're on these medications, okay? You are currently medicated because of the way that you are currently eating, okay? The food you have, the meds you're on, are creating the blood sugars or the A1C that you currently experience, even if they're not perfect. This is the equation that's happening. So you are currently on medications because of the foods that you're eating, okay? Sometimes those medications and the foods, right? Like sometimes that'll get your A1C to say 8 or 7, where we know an optimal A1C is going to be around 5.4 or less, okay? I know the medical community says like, no, it just needs to be below 7, and they'll get excited if you're like below 6.4, they'll take you off your medicines, right? But recognize that's not optimal. And we're going to talk about why that is. And it has to do with insulin resistance, not blood sugar management. But do understand the meds you are on are because of the food you eat. So if you change the foods you eat, you should expect that the medications are going to have to be changed also. And if you don't address that and you just change the foods, these meds could drive your blood sugars down very low, and that can make you very sick. It can be dangerous. So do not make that mistake, okay? When you're changing the foods that you're eating, you're probably going to have to change your medications. The one medication I would say is a caveat to this and not as relevant. I love metformin. As a physician, I love metformin. I don't take it. I do have a prescription of it. I just don't take it. The evidence behind metformin and as a longevity supplement is staggering. And that's why I have a prescription. I have 2 pill bottles for a 180-day supply of metformin. I don't take it because even if I'm creating longevity and I have optimal health and I'm creating longevity by using pills, I just really cannot get my brain and my authenticity and my integrity behind better living through chemistry. So I don't take it, but the evidence is so staggering behind metformin that I actually have gotten that prescription because the evidence is just substantial. So that set aside about the longevity associated with metformin, and if you ever want to have a conversation about that, let me know. We will do that. But metformin is the one medication that really you have a very low, there's just no likelihood. It's not the way the medicine works that it's going to drive your blood sugar down in a way that's going to make you sick. It's just not the way it works. It does not work by increasing insulin and overriding your body's mechanisms for managing your blood sugar. That's not how metformin works. So if you're on metformin, you can really make some really aggressive dietary changes and not have to be worried about it driving your blood sugar too low. So please hear me on that. If you're only on metformin, high five up top, run with this. If you are on any other medication, you really need to be having a very frank conversation with your physician to let them know that you're making these dietary changes and that you're going to keep a close eye on your blood sugars, but you may call them and say, hey, listen, these were what my blood sugars were. What do I do? Okay. This is my medical legal disclaimer and it's recorded. It's like out here for everybody. So recognize this is a safety thing. Yes, to keep me safe, but more importantly, way more importantly, to keep you safe. Making these dietary changes without evaluating your med list and having a doc on board or somebody that you can call, a professional on board that you can call and say, hey, I need help and what I need to do with this right now, is very important. Recognize if your doc does not have the same goal for you of you coming off your medications that you have for you, you may want to consider getting a different doctor. Okay. Your doctor works for you. You don't work for your doctor. Okay. Your health is yours, not theirs. You have to take this agency and this power over it. And if your doc doesn't have the same goals that you have in mind, you probably need to start shopping around for a different doctor. Okay. So, but don't try to make these changes without having that doctor that has these same goals in mind for you to contact and say, hey, doc, listen, my blood sugars are down this low. What do I do about this med that I'm on? Do you want me to take it today or no? Okay. So that's my disclaimer. Don't get yourself sick here. All right. So what is type 2 diabetes? This is one of the most important bases for you to understand in order for you to understand how to fix your diabetes. Physicians know that this is diabetes, but they don't address what type 2 diabetes actually is. They just address the blood sugars. Type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance. What do I mean by insulin resistance? I mean, when your cells are overexposed to insulin, so that's high concentrations of insulin over a prolonged period of time, that makes your cells resistant to the effect of insulin. That makes them insulin resistant. And this means that your cells just stop responding. They're resistant to doing what insulin is trying to tell them to do. So it stops responding to all of the insulin in your system in a way that can be predicted or expected. What this allows is our blood sugars to climb quite high. And that is, the high blood sugars are a problem. That is a disease state. That's an issue and we need to address it. But the problem is that this is what docs pick up on. And this is what doctors and medicines aim to improve, is just this blood sugar component, where what the cause is that we have too much insulin in our body. So again, this insulin resistance is the problem, and it develops from high concentrations over a prolonged period of time. That is insulin resistance, and that is what causes type 2 diabetes. So all of the strategies that I teach for insulin or for reversing your type 2 diabetes is really to normalize this insulin component. It's to reverse this insulin resistance, because that's what's actually going to fix the issue at hand. So the first strategy that I teach, if you've ever heard me talk about this, I say it a lot, partly because it's clever and funny and I'm entertained by it, but partly because it's just so frankly true that it becomes very obvious as to where the issue is. Cleaning up your diet is the first strategy that I teach. Of all of the animals on all of the earth, human beings are the only animals that are not eating the food that the earth makes for us. This is kind of philosophical for me because I really do believe we're like humans of the earth. We like keep thinking that we're going to trash out the earth and move to some other planet and be able to live. But what I want to offer is we are part of the earth and part of the system and the living planet that the earth is, right? So like, I don't know that we can really be detached from the earth. I think that we are part of the earth. And this again is my philosophy, but recognize the earth makes all of the food that we need perfectly for us. And it does this for all of the other animals on the earth. Squirrels are not complaining about acorns and asking for pizza at night. And deer does not get bored with grass and ask for Chinese food. We are the only animal on all of the planet that says, yeah, I see your lettuce, your cucumbers, and tomatoes, and we choose to eat Red Bulls and Doritos, and then we can't figure out why we're sick. Some animals have such a narrow food option, like koalas can only eat eucalyptus leaves. Like anything else, it makes them sick. If you consider the zoo, like when you go take your kids to the zoo or whatever, think about the amount of resources, like research and development that the zoo puts into creating food sources for the giraffes that's appropriate for the giraffe, right? We are the only animal on all of the planet that do not put any thought into that. Like we don't, either we're not following the laws of nature. I don't think the giraffes are really putting any thought into that. We're not following the laws of nature. The giraffes in nature are following those laws, right? The human being understands that if we misfeed the giraffe, that the giraffe's going to get sick. But the human being does not think about that for themselves. If we misfeed the human being will get sick too. And it's not because we're broken. It's not because genetically we're defunct and we have a setup for type 2 diabetes. It is because we are not following the laws of nature. And the laws of nature state that the human being is meant to eat certain types of food that the earth makes, and we're not eating those. Now, can the squirrel go and eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Yeah, the squirrel can steal a peanut butter and jelly sandwich from a picnic basket, and it will eat that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it will feel amazing because the dopamine release from that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it will not die that day. But if the squirrel eats the peanut butter and jelly sandwich every day, the squirrel is going to get sick too. And it's because it's just not the food the human being or the squirrel is really meant to eat, okay? So that is what I mean by cleaning up our diet. Recognize flour and sugar is it's the primary component of most of the foods in the what we call standard American diet. I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. Flour and sugar are refined and processed. Yes, we can find wheat in the ground and we can find sugarcane in the ground. But when we put it into flour and sugar, it's gone through a processing that concentrates the carbohydrate components of both of those foods. That is what causes this huge insulin release that overexposes ourselves to a high concentration over a prolonged period of time. When we're eating foods from the ground, from the earth, they're in their natural forms and they're composed of all their natural chemicals or all their natural components. They have the macronutrients, which is the carbohydrate, protein, fat, right? Those are our macronutrients. In addition, they have fiber bound to the carbohydrate component, and that's very important in the way that our body processes that carbohydrate component. They also have micronutrients, your vitamins, your minerals. They also have phytochemicals, things that we can't even produce in the lab. All of these things are in a natural ratio in foods when they're in their natural form. But when we process it, we lose this ratio, these ratios of all these different things. We lose some of the components entirely. And then what happens is we concentrate. The ratio of carbohydrates really becomes the highest component and we lose the protein and fat. All of that's altered, okay? The fiber content is typically removed when we go through the processing of foods. In fact, we add it back, which is just insane. Like we had it in the food, but then we process it and then we add it back in this other processed form. It's crazy. So this is the problem with flour and sugar and the problem with the processing of our foods. So what stimulates this insulin resistance and what's stimulating insulin production is that the standard American diet has this huge amount of processed foods, the flour and the sugar, all of it, but it's a huge amount of processed foods, and that processing of the food causes a concentration of carbohydrates, which gives us this huge insulin, this very dramatic insulin release, okay? Remember, insulin, this dramatic amount of insulin is the cause of your type 2 diabetes. High insulin levels, prolonged period of times. So the standard American diet, or as I like to call it, the SAD diet, SAD, it's just loaded down with carbohydrates. And we're going to talk about that, the amount of carbohydrates that's in the standard American diet. So why this cleaning up your diet component works is because you stop eating the refined foods, the refined sugars and carbohydrates, allows your insulin levels to drop low and normalize. When your cells get a break from the insulin, it allows them to resensitize to it. So they start showing up. Insulin isn't always in the system, but only in the system and in an appropriate amount with your meals. Then suddenly your body is able to, your cells are able to say, oh, insulin's here. I need to listen to what insulin's saying. What is it telling me to do? And insulin opens up your cells, brings the energy in the form of glucose inside the cell, and allows the cell to utilize that as fuel, and that burns off and your cell does its job, and you don't have all this glucose in your system, and insulin isn't in your system all the time, so your cells can start normally functioning. So don't fret. I'm not saying all carbohydrates have to go. We're going to talk about this. I do recommend smart carbohydrates. Recognize there's no need for carbohydrate. There's no requirement for carbohydrate in the human body. The human body can make carbohydrates from both fats. So it can make glucose, which is what carbohydrates get broken down into. And that's what our cells use as energy. Okay, that's the cellular fuel. And your body can make it from fat and protein. We don't need to take it in. But what I do want to offer to you is all of the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals are on those carbohydrates, right? Like chicken isn't carrying all of that, you know, all the fiber, certainly not carrying the fiber that we need. And most of the time you're not getting your vitamins. So your calcium, your, you know, our green leafy vegetables have calcium, our vitamin A, that's what our carrots have, right? Like those vitamins and minerals are coming in on our carbohydrates, on our vegetables, not on our meats and our fats. So we do need the carbohydrates for that. But I will tell you, there's absolutely no necessity for flour. That is not a necessity for the human being. So all the things that are made of flour are not a necessity for the human being biologically, okay? So smart carbs, not no carbs. So the next strategy that I teach is intermittent fasting. I love this strategy because I think it's really clever. I also think it makes eating very easy. When we're not consuming food all the time, it makes it really easy to plan for your day. So intermittent fasting, I joke a lot that fasting is the other F word. It is not like starving, but people get confused about this, right? They think they're going to fast. Oh my gosh, you're asking me to starve to death? No. Fasting is to starving what running for exercise is to running from an assailant, right? Like when we run from an assailant, we're doing it to save our life. When we run for exercise, we're doing it to make our lives healthier, to prolong our lives. When you're fasting for health reasons, it's similar to running for exercise. When you're starving to death, it's similar to running from an assailant, right? Like starving to death is not the equivalent of fasting. These are not the same things. When we fast, we're doing it by choice because it makes us healthier. When we're starving, we're not doing it by choice, okay? So intermittent fasting is not starving. Intermittent fasting is simply a period of time each day that you are not consuming food. When we're constantly consuming food, that's constantly stimulating our pancreas to make insulin, okay? That's that prolonged period of time. When we stop that component, intermittent fasting addresses that component of the two criteria that make insulin resistance, right? High concentrations, prolonged period of time. When we clean up our diet, we're limiting the concentration of insulin that we get exposed to. When we do intermittent fasting, we're limiting the time frame that our bodies are exposed to insulin. So you have eating windows, you have fasting windows. There are a million different ways you can do this, and none of them is perfect. What you create when you fast is you have this narrow your eating window. So this is an intermittent fasting regimen of a 16-hour fast with an 8-hour eating window, okay? I personally fast typically 20 to 22 hours a day, most days. Some days it's more like 18 and 6, but very rarely, I mean, sometimes it's an 8-hour eating window now, but very rarely is it ever longer than that. And most of the time that's really because I'm following hunger cues in my body and I'm just not hungry more than that. But you can see here, if you're only eating in this window, this 8-hour eating window, you're getting 8 hours where your body is stimulating insulin production. You're getting 16 hours where your body isn't. So for a good chunk of these 16 hours, your cells are actually exposed to a very low amount of insulin, and that allows your cells to resensitize to insulin, to the message that insulin is giving, right? Remember, insulin resistance occurs when you have high concentrations over a prolonged period of time. If you narrow that prolonged period of time, it allows your cells to not be exposed to insulin and start to wake up again to the message insulin's giving them. So that is how intermittent fasting is such a powerful tool. The standard American diet, again, the SAD diet, is consumption of foods that stimulate insulin production all day long. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about everything from energy bars and protein bars. I'm talking about your real food that you actually eat in the form of meals. I'm talking about energy drinks. I'm talking about diet drinks. And I know that everybody wants to say, but wait, diet drinks don't have any carbohydrates in them. There's no calories in them. There's nothing in them. There is a process that develops for some human beings, most human beings, and I would offer human beings that have type 2 diabetes, you should probably just bank this is happening for you. When you taste sweetness on your tongue, that your taste bud sends a message to the brain that says, hey, we're getting carbohydrates. And your brain sends a message to the pancreas, say, hey, prep up for some carbohydrates because we just got sweetness on the tongue. And your pancreas starts spitting out insulin, okay? So this makes tons of sense. The only place in nature where our tongue comes into contact with sweetness is when it is paired or connected to a high carbohydrate load: bananas, apples, sweet potatoes, honey, maple syrup. This is the only place in nature that our tongue comes into contact with that sweetness. So it has developed this way of sending a message and prepping for the processing of those calories, those carbohydrates, okay? So even diet drinks, and that's where we have to be really careful, right? Like if you look at keto bricks, and if you're not sure what a keto brick is, Google it. It's hysterical. It's this brick of what I call Frankenfood. It's not even real food. But of course, like it's supposed to replace meals, and it's supposed to have protein and fat and no carbs. And they're chocolate peanut butter cups. I'm like, well, how do you make them taste that way? They make them taste this way by putting artificial sweetener in it. And the way that it hijacks, the way that it's like, oh, it's not even going to work, is because you get this stimulus in your brain from the sweetness on your tongue to tell your pancreas to go ahead and spit out some insulin, and it breaks your fast. It breaks the whole point of doing keto. So recognize those diet drinks. If whatever you are consuming tastes sweet, it is stimulating this insulin production. So even if you want it in your life, that's fine. You just can't have it during, like, it may break that fasting. It may undo the efforts you're putting into fasting. So recognize that about the diet drinks. Also, your Cappuccino Frappabapas that we get at Starbucks first thing in the morning and we sip on all morning long. Those things are loaded with sugar or sweeteners, and you're stimulating your body to produce that insulin. Remember, a prolonged period of times. This is the standard American diet. The standard American diet causes us to release insulin all day long. That release of insulin all day long leads to the insulin resistance, which causes your type 2 diabetes. So this is what it looks like all day long, right? Like you're eating breakfast at, 7:30, you're having lunch, and you have all these snacks and this coffee and these Frappabapas and Diet Cokes for me. Like that was what I was eating and drinking all day. And I would eat, and this was what was happening all day long. This is the standard American diet, and this is what creates insulin resistance. This insulin level on this line, which is what these graphs are measuring, is insulin. It says that it drops off. You have a snack at like 11 o'clock and it drops off by 12. The half-life of insulin is about an hour and a half. So that means that the insulin is going to stay in your system for 4 times that at least. So you're really not dropping off your insulin level until sometime in the early morning when you're asleep. So you're only getting a few hours of your cells where they're not exposed to insulin. And this is probably really aggressive. Over time, you actually have this prolongation of the insulin being in your system, and it's due to the insulin resistance. It's also due to the type of foods that we're eating and how much insulin is being exposed or being released into our system. So over time, you're ratcheting up even this fasting level of insulin, okay? And that's just how the standard American diet works. That's why it creates type 2 diabetes. That's why there's an epidemic of type 2 diabetes in America. So this is what it looks like. And this is what we're trying to resolve, or this is what intermittent fasting is trying to fix, is this prolonged exposure to insulin. So my recommendations are not that you go from eating that long, prolonged window of eating to like cutting it down 4 hours a day or 2 hours a day. You will not think I'm very cool. You will be very angry at me. There will be an unpleasant experience, and it's very difficult to stick with that when it's painful. So I encourage folks to look at what they are currently eating. What's your current eating pattern? If you start eating at 7 o'clock in the morning with breakfast and you stop eating at 8 p.m. with, after dinner is done, I recommend you start looking at that, because that's where you stimulate your insulin. So I would also offer, if you're not having real breakfast, but you're having a smoothie or a Capra or a Diet Coke, and that's what your first thing in the morning is, that sweetness, it's probably breaking that fast. If that's what's happening, that's when you're starting your insulin production. And then you look at when you're done eating, and recognize that just through the process of digestion, you're not done stimulating insulin just because you're done putting food in your mouth, right? There's the absorption of the food in the stomach, or I guess in the small intestine, that's where we're absorbing the food. That stimulates that insulin production. So as long as there's food being digested in your system, you're probably still stimulating that insulin production. But look at when you start, when do you end? Right? What's happening for most days, and then you adjust both by 1 hour. So you move your starting for eating by 1 hour and you cut it back 1 hour. And then over a few weeks, you're just narrowing that in until you get the results you like. I would also encourage you to stop snacking between meals. If you still sense food in your stomach, and that's an art form to learn how, when there's food still in your stomach, if you're still sensing food in your stomach, you still have food in your stomach. There is no hunger. You're not hungry. You can't be hungry. You still have food in your stomach, right? So and most of the time it takes 6 to 8 hours to transit that food out of your stomach. So the need for snacking is not there. There's no need for snacking, okay? The less you're eating between meals, of course, the more you're allowing that insulin level to possibly drop off. Okay, so you just continue the squeezing in of your meals until you get the results you want. Again, why it works: intermittent fasting allows time for your insulin levels to drop between the next exposure to insulin. That dropping of the insulin allows your cells to resensitize, and that reverses your type 2 diabetes. So that's how it works, okay? So let's talk about nutritional ketosis. This is a strategy that a lot of people like to use, and they like to use it because I think that folks feel like there is more ability to eat. Sometimes we just don't like feeling hungry, and that's totally okay. So nutritional ketosis is changing the fuel sourcing for the cells. So remember, we talked about how we eat carbohydrates, and carbohydrates gets broken down into glucose, and glucose stimulates insulin, and insulin allows the cells to open up and bring in that glucose that your cells then burn off as fuel to do the things that the cell does, right? The cells are little powerhouses, and they need energy to do their things. So brain cells need energy to think, and muscle cells need energy to contract, and heart cells need energy to pump, and liver cells need energy to do like the detoxification that the liver does. So your cells need energy, and glucose is the energy that most of our cells are using because we're providing our body with mostly carbohydrates, okay? And when they're there readily available, we don't have to break down fat to make carbohydrate, to make glucose. We don't have to convert protein to make glucose whenever we're just constantly consuming glucose or carbohydrates. Our body just breaks down the glucose or the carbohydrates and uses glucose from that. Nutritional ketosis is switching from utilizing glucose as our primary energy source to utilizing fat as our primary energy source. So that's a process, a cellular chemical process that happens in our body, and our body can do that, okay? It takes a process. There's a shift in our biochemistry. And again, when our body is used to doing it one way, our body is going to want to do it that way because we're very efficient at doing it that way. When we do this shift, so there's like what the keto flu that people talk about, right? The keto flu is the shifting from doing it with glucose as our primary energy source to living life with fat as our primary energy source. And there is this slowdown. And sometimes it's pretty uncomfortable and you don't feel very good as your body starts to utilize a different form of energy. But this is a long known form of energy utilization. Ketosis is. Our bodies are meant to do that. 10,000 years ago, when there wasn't food on every corner, our body converted between glucose as energy and fat as energy very easily. And you can retrain your body to do that. Bodies are meant to do that. Like, this is how we became the dominant species on the planet, was that our body was able to be metabolically adaptive. That's what they call it, metabolically adaptive. But for most of us, especially those of us with type 2 diabetes, we've not done this in a very long time. We've not metabolically adapted from using glucose to using fat in a very long time. And so there's this discomfort that goes along with it. But that is what nutritional ketosis is. If you have ever heard of diabetic ketoacidosis, recognize these are very different things. Diabetic ketoacidosis is a dangerous pathologic disease that is a requirement for immediate medical attention. So if that is what you are in, if you feel like that's what you are in, please get medical attention. That's what needs to happen. Diabetic ketoacidosis is three things. Diabetes, meaning that you have high blood sugars in the moment. Not that you carry a diagnosis of diabetes, but that in that moment you have diabetes. Your blood sugars are very high. Most of the time, your blood sugar is going to have to be above 400 to get into this disease state. So one, you have diabetes. Two, you have ketones, diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, right? Ketones, which is what is shared between nutritional ketosis and diabetic ketoacidosis. And then you have acidotic blood. So your blood is in a pH range that's acidotic. This happens due to not insulin in the system and these very high blood sugars. Nutritional ketosis, you have very low insulin levels. Like, that's the point. You're driving your insulin level low. You're not stimulating insulin. You're also not eating carbohydrates, so your blood sugars aren't very high. Those are the differences between nutritional ketosis and diabetic ketoacidosis. One is a normal metabolic adaptation. The other is a disease process that needs medical attention right now. Okay, so don't let those two things cross. And if a doctor's like, you want to do nutritional ketosis, that's DKA. Understand they mean well, but they're just confused, right? Like, they just haven't considered nutritional ketosis and the fact that that's just a different metabolic pathway that they were taught in biochemistry in college. They just have forgotten about it. And all that they know is how to diagnose a disease and treat it, which is what we're trained to do as physicians. And when they hear that overlap, they get anxious, and that's fine. They're only meaning to help you out, but recognize there's a difference between these two things. So the standard American diet, we're talking about carbohydrates here, right? And the need for carbohydrates or lack thereof. There is no biological need for carbohydrates in the human being. Again, your liver will make all of the glucose that you need out of either fat or protein, okay? The average American diet consumes somewhere between 250 and 350 grams of carbohydrates each day, total grams of carbohydrates each day. The average American diet consumes somewhere around 80 to 100 grams of protein. You actually have an essential requirement for protein each day. And of course, because we demonized fat somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, the 1900s, I guess, we demonized fat in 1950, 1940s, 1960s, right? Everything's low fat, right? So depending on how much you buy into this low fat movement, depends on how many grams of fat you're getting in your diet. But recognize you're getting 250 to 350 grams of carbohydrates, which you have no biological need for. And you're getting maybe 80 grams of protein, which you have a biological need for. There are things called essential amino acids. And what we mean by essential, whenever you hear essential in front of amino acids or fatty acids, it just means that your human body is unable to synthesize, to make that specific amino acid, that essential amino acid on its own. You need to consume that in your mouth every day in order for your body to get that amino acid and utilize it, because you're never going to make it. Same thing with fats. There are essential fatty acids and you have to consume them because your human body cannot make them. Your human body can make all the glucose it needs to, if you're having these other things, of course, right? But we're eating primarily carbohydrates that we don't actually need in replacement, like we're eating those instead of the carbohydrate or the proteins and the fatty acids that we need, okay? So there's no biological need for carbohydrates there are for proteins and fatty acids. We get it very backwards in our standard American diet, okay? We're eating far too many carbs. Nutritional ketosis definitely addresses this, right? We drop our carb intake quite low, and that allows us to start utilizing the fat and working through that. But more than that, it allows us to let our insulin levels drop so that we are not over consuming that and creating, again, that high concentration over a prolonged period of time of insulin. So I want to make sure that I did not miss a slide here. Okay, so my recommendations: you decrease your daily carb intake, period, end of sentence, right? Like that is going to be the primary component. You got diabetic again from the foods that you ate. That's what causes type 2 diabetes. When we change that, part of that big change is dropping the carbohydrate intake. And again, I'm not saying no carbohydrates. That's not what I just don't think that's even right or healthy. We need those carbs, those carrots, those veggies, the lettuce, the tubers, whatever. We need those things to bring in our micronutrients. So, but you drop it very low. And then you check your ketones. You can pee on a stick, which is the cheapest, easiest way. You can also get like Keto Mojo. It's a monitor, like it's like a blood sugar machine that you check at home, and you can check your ketones that way. I dive into this more specifically, but this is the basic way. You drop your carbohydrates, you check your ketones. It takes about 12 to 36 hours for those ketones to show up on those keto sticks, those urine sticks. More ketones are not necessarily better, but you just want to start seeing ketones in your urine, okay? I recommend dropping to about 50 grams of carbs a day, and then measuring your ketones every 36 hours to see if you're going into ketosis, okay? So 50 grams of carbs per day is what I recommend. I recommend that you eat about 80 to 100 grams of protein. Recognize there is a amount of protein that if you eat past a certain threshold, that's individualized, right? Like for each human, that's a little different. But if you eat past a certain number of amino acids, proteins in a single meal, your liver will start trying to store those up by making them into glucose and storing them as fat. That conversion of amino acids into glucose will stimulate insulin production in order to store it as fat. So you don't want to get too many proteins in your system. So 50 grams of carbs per day, 80 to 100 grams of proteins per day, somewhere between 100 and 130, 150 grams of fat per day. That's huge. That's mind-blowing for most people. That's what you want to do. You record what you're eating each day and these macronutrients. You compare that with your blood sugars. That's the big thing we're trying to do here, right? If you're trying to go into ketosis, you compare it with ketone sticks and see if you're going into ketosis. Recognize whenever I talk about measuring blood sugars, I always tell people to measure your fasting blood sugar, because that's different than your blood sugars after your meals. So fastings and 2 hours after your meal. Don't measure anything in between. It's just a waste of your strip. Like, it's not relevant. I mean, not that it's not relevant. It is. It's just that all of our standards are set up on this 2 hour after your meal schedule. Okay. So measuring that, your fasting blood sugar is different. Don't let it dictate what's going on. That is going to be the last thing to normalize. Check out the podcast that I did where I talked about fasting blood sugars and what they mean and why it's the last to normalize. Okay. You can also compare what you're eating with your weight. That's a nice surrogate marker of your blood sugars, but it is not linear and it's very frustrating for most women. So I don't recommend using that as your primary way of monitoring whether you're fixing your blood sugars or not. Okay, using a finger sticker, you can pick them up at any pharmacy for $20. One of the ladies in the group, she calls it the finger prick machine. She calls it her prick machine. I love it. But yeah, getting one of those is going to be the best way to really get clear on what's happening with the food that you're eating compared to your blood sugars. Recognize that everybody's biology is a little different. I don't make up the rules as to how many carbohydrates you can eat. Measuring your carbohydrates, checking your blood sugars is going to be how you figure out how your biology is working. So recognizing that nutritional ketosis works because you're utilizing fat as your primary fuel source for your cells versus glucose. When you're doing that, fat goes into the cell to be utilized as fuel in an insulin independent way. Gosh, that's really a lot of sciencey terms. Fat gets absorbed into your cells without using insulin. Okay, like it doesn't need insulin for the cells to bring it in and utilize it as energy. glucose does, right? So if you're having all this carbohydrate and you're using that as your primary fuel source, you're also using it via insulin. And we're trying to normalize that insulin resistance by dropping the insulin level very low. Okay, this is what nutritional ketosis does. Remember, all the strategies that I teach are aimed at the same thing, lowering your insulin level, because your insulin is the cause of your type 2 diabetes. So lowering that insulin level is going to allow you to normalize your blood sugars. Okay, people get all excited about the blood sugar component, and I get it. There is relevance to that. Having blood sugars in the 300 to 400 range is toxic to your cells. It's important to fix that. But recognizing just causing that blood sugar to go lower can be done by adding more insulin, like just an ever increasing amount of more insulin to override the cell's insulin resistance. That will drive the blood sugar down, but it will not fix your diabetes. And that's why meds don't fix type 2 diabetes. You have to actually change the foods that you're eating. Okay. So talk to your doctor, let your doctor know what you're wanting to do here. Review your medication list to be sure that it's safe to make these dietary changes. If your doctor's not on board, it might be time to look for a new doctor and find that other doctor that will help you through this journey. Remember, your doctor works for you. It's not the other way around. Food logs are really important. It's the way that you use to evaluate what your body is doing and what your specific needs are. Again, some humans tolerate more carbohydrates than other humans. I don't get to make up the rules. It's just what happens. You're not going to know unless you're measuring your blood sugars and comparing it to the macronutrient count you're taking in. And again, I say macronutrient count. Most of the time it's just the carbohydrates, but a lot of times some people are so uncomfortable and unpracticed at not having food in their belly. And also this component that I'm going to talk about here briefly, this component of why we eat, right? When we have a disease called type 2 diabetes, we've eaten so much that we have a disease called type 2 diabetes. There is nothing about food that's fixing anything, right? We're creating disease with it. When we have obesity, and if you look at the rates of obesity in America, no Americans are starving because we have obesity. And the reasons that we're eating are no longer for biology. We're eating for other reasons. And that's thought work. That's where coaching comes in. But recognize that you're not going to know what you actually need until you start like really recording and looking at what's going on. There's a food log that I have, and that's getting revamped. And if you're follow me on Instagram, because that's going to be coming out. Part of it's going to be a food log, but part of it's also going to be a how to decide what to eat, how to create. That's what everybody comes to me. I need somebody to give me a food list. I need somebody to tell me what to eat. And there's going to be a PDF coming out about that. So follow that. And if you want the food log, let me know, and I can send that out actually with the video link for this. The last thing, again, is where to get started. So how to get started. If you're going to do nutritional ketosis, drop your carbohydrates to 50 to 100 grams of carbs per day. If your blood sugars are still high after that, cut it by 20%. So if you drop to 100 and 7 days later, your blood sugars are still high, drop to 80. That's 20% less than 100. So I don't know. I can do that math, but I get it. Math isn't for everybody. So that's why I'm walking you through it. I'm not trying to be offensive. I just get that sometimes that's hard to understand. If you do 80 grams of carbs per day for 7 days and your blood sugars still aren't dropping, drop it by 16. 16 is 20% of 80. So that's going to bring you down to 74. 64. See, math really is hard. So do 64 grams of carbs per day for 7 days. And if that doesn't get your blood sugars down after 7 days, drop it by another 20%. So that's going to be like 13 grams of carbs down. I'm doing math. So that's going to bring you down to like 51 grams of carbs. I have found for most women, you had to drop to somewhere around 50 grams of carbs to see these changes that you want. Okay. Same thing. If you've dropped your carbs and you're down to like 30 grams of carbs per day, 20 grams of carbs per day, and your sugars aren't normalizing at that point, I would have you look at your protein. That's probably what you need to adjust. And you're going to do it the same way. You're going to drop it by about 20% each week until you get to the numbers you want. This is why collecting the data is so imperative. So this walks you through about dropping the carbs, how you would look at the protein, drop another 20% for 3 to 7 days, and then monitor your sugars. Eventually your sugars will normalize out, but sometimes it does take a few days. I would get curious if you've got your proteins down to 60 grams and you've got carbs down to 20 to 30 grams and you're not seeing blood sugars. I would get curious about the other things that you're putting in your mouth. Mints, gums, drinks, crystal lights. Are they sweetened with artificial sweetener? Because if they are, you probably need to cut those out. And I would also get curious about stress management and sleep at that point. But most people, if they drop their carbohydrates, they're going to see improvement in their blood sugars. Make sure you're getting healthy fats into your diet. If you're not getting healthy fats into your diet, you're going to feel hungry a lot. You've been eating these carbohydrates to fill up. You're going to change to start eating fats to fill up. Fat makes you feel full. Fat also makes our food taste amazing. So be really copious, liberal, just bring all the fats. Now be smart about it. Olive oil has the most evidence for being the healthiest of the fats. So I would definitely be cooking things with olive oil. I would be using olive oil in my dressings. I would be doing all of that. Being careful of saturated fats. Do not consume trans fats. Trans fats are dangerous. Trans fats are so dangerous, they're actually illegal in Europe. Don't consume anything with trans fats in it. Be sure that you're not cooking your foods to a smoking point. If your fats are smoking, it is because they're converting into trans fats. So you've killed off the olive oil and now it's not healthy because it's a trans fat if you're allowing that to smoke. So don't allow that to happen either. Okay. So make sure you're getting a lot of healthy fats. Make sure you're avoiding those artificial sweeteners. Make sure you're getting plenty of sleep, guys. If you're not getting sleep, not only are you kicking off hunger signaling in your brain, but you're also causing insulin to be released because your body is stressed. Okay. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water. Your brain will send you a signal that you're thirsty and it feels a lot like you're hungry. So make sure you're getting a lot of water. Most people are aware of that. Lastly, what I work with my clients on, and this is what I want to offer you, knowing the skills, like y'all know you don't need any more stickers in your life. Y'all know chocolate cake's a problem. You probably know bread's the problem. You probably are aware pasta's an issue. You all know this. This is not news. These are skills that I teach people. But what I want to offer is most people find that those skills are not enough. If anything I just said about Snickers or cake or bread and pasta was news to you, that may be all the information you need to know. High five up top, run with that. See what you can create. Most people know that that's the issue and they can't figure out why they continue to eat foods that are cutting years off their life and making them sick. That is what coaching does. That is the main part of my group program, as we work on coaching and reprogramming your thoughts and beliefs in your brain in order for you to stop eating foods that are killing you, right? That are creating disease and cutting years off your life. These are the things that commercial weight loss programs, Jenny Craig, Weight Watchers really don't put enough effort into. They think that you need a points program or you just need to order their food and put it in the microwave and eat it. And what I want to offer to you is that is not the issue. It's why do I think chocolate cake eaten in a way that creates diabetes in my body is a reward, is something I deserve, is something I need. Why am I thinking that? What is it I'm believing about the way I'm eating now that continues to make me eat that way? That's a coaching issue. And that's what my program works on. So there is an e-journal. And again, I'll send it out with this video. It talks about thought downloads. It talks about really starting to get curious about what your mind's offering you. I'd highly encourage you to work with that. It is the difference between what I do in my program and just these, getting a food plan. It overcomes these ideas that nothing will work or that, no one tells me how to, this doesn't work either, I can't figure it out. Learning how to work through those thoughts and like, oh, it's just something my brain's offering me, it doesn't make it true. The other thought that I find that is tragic, because I really think that it's promoted by the healthcare industry, which is a huge misnomer. Like the healthcare industry clearly needs a different name because it's not really promoting health. But when the medical environment in the Western medical environment promotes that things are created by our genes, that our genes is genetic, this is familial. And that is such a, one, it's not true. And two, I mean, it's not entirely true. I get that genes and familial transmission of disease processes are real, but it's not true about diabetes. It's not true about most of our chronic disease states. Most of our chronic disease states are lifestyle mediated. People are like, but it runs in my family. I'm like, yeah, my love for apple pie and pizza, that runs in my family too. I learned to eat. I learned to manage my life for my family. So if it made them sick, it makes sense it's going to make me sick. When we believe it's our genes, when you believe that story that it's genetically mediated, that it's genetically caused, it doesn't leave you a lot of ability to change it. It's not true, and it makes us feel helpless. And the only thing then we have is medicine. Okay. So I want to offer to you, that is one of those thoughts that like we really have to unpackage. Does this even serve me? And is this something I want? That's what I do in coaching. So if you have questions about any of this, one, if you're making dietary changes and you have questions, please, please, please send me an email. You're not hanging out there in the wind alone. I answer all the emails. I will answer your email. I will usually use it for a podcast because whatever you're asking, almost always somebody else has that same question. And I want to make sure that that information is getting out there. So email me. If you're ever not sure or feeling unsafe, email me. Check out my podcast, Reversing Diabetes with Delane MD. Most people find me through there, but if you don't know about that podcast, please check out that podcast. I put it out there because it's free information for people. I truly, in my soul of souls, believe that everybody should be able to live a naturally healthy life without type 2 diabetes. And that podcast is my child, my baby, that makes that information out there available for everybody. Okay. So check out that podcast. You can find it on my website, delanemd.com. You can find it on iTunes. You can find it on Stitcher. You can find it on all those podcasting places. And lastly, follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Delane MD. My mom gave me a unique name, so everybody can find me. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It will talk about any free sessions like this and anything else. And you can get a hold of me through messengers on there. So Lynn has a question. Does the 2-hour check of blood sugar comes 2 hours after the first bite or 2 hours after the end of the meal? So this is a great question. That's a great question, Lynn, because there's not a really great answer for it. But I'm going to tell you my 10 cents on it. So one, I recommend doing it 2 hours after the middle of the meal. So if you start eating at noon and you're done at 12:45, I would check your blood sugar at 220, 225, somewhere in that range. Your meals, really be careful. They should not be grazing, right? The whole point here is we're trying to narrow or limit the amount of insulin exposure. So really a meal should be consumed and done in 30 to 45 minutes. And I'm not promoting like snarfing down our food. It's just not fun. I wouldn't promote that, but do understand if your meal is lasting 2 hours, that's a problem, right? So I always do it from the midpoint of the meal. I think that that's kind of what makes sense. Even if you ask a doctor, everybody has their, like the way they want their patients to do it, but there's no consensus on what that means. So I just do it 2 hours after the middle of the meal and recognize if you're 10 minutes this way or 10 minutes that way, nobody's losing sleep over that. If you're at 5 hours, that's not a helpful blood sugar. If you're at 1 hour, that's not a helpful blood sugar. I would even say at 90 minutes, that's not a helpful blood sugar. I would always err on doing it a little bit longer, somewhere between 2.5 hours. So Lynn, if that doesn't answer your question, make sure you let me know. If anybody else has any questions, we've got a few more minutes here and I'm happy to stay and answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm sorry the chat's not open. I know exactly the box I need to click in Zoom to make that fixed, but clearly I haven't clicked that. So next time I will. You guys are all more, again, please email me with any questions. I don't ever want anybody to feel like they're hanging in the wind and there's no help out there. There is help out there. This can totally be fixed. The podcast this week, I think I just put it out. I think I just posted it this morning. I go over an email. I actually read an email of one of the women who is never signed to my program, but has used the podcast and used these free seminars to create this. So, and it comes from her belief that there's got to be a different way. This cannot be just meds. There's got to be another way. So please, I hope that that's something that you hear, that there is a different way. You don't have to be sick. There's nothing wrong with your human body. If you have type 2 diabetes, for the overwhelming majority of people with type 2 diabetes in America, it is due to the way that we eat. It is not due to your genetic makeup, and you are not broken. So if you're hoping that there is a way to fix this, there's totally a way to fix this. If you are interested in the program and working and really diving into this and really getting all the help that you need, send me an email. We will set up a consult and you can get the answers to how that would work and what that looks like, and start on that process and on that path to getting yourself naturally healthy. I hope this has been helpful, guys. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much for showing up, and look for my next free session, and hopefully I'll see you there. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.